Forever and a Day. Chapter 5. Max Weber. Annalise had been in the hospital for 3 days. In that time, she had been medicated for the pain and sleep-deprived because the nurses would come into her room and check up on her every few hours during the night. She probably would have been screaming at everyone if the drugs weren't keeping her agreeable. Joe was there most of the time. Even though he wasn't making much progress in his search for answers, and probably wouldn't until she was home, he wanted to make sure that nobody else got to her. One visit from Roy Mitchell or another reporter, and she could have her word spread all over the country in a matter of hours. She was hardly in the right frame of mind to be giving interviews. Finally, after about a day and a half, the doctors cut her medication and started preparing her to go home. She'd have to take it easy, they told her. But something told Joe that this girl wasn't normally one for hard manual labor in the first place. On her last evening in the hospital, as she sat in her bed and Joe was reading the newspaper in his normal chair, she turned to him and asked, "Why are you here?" He looked up from his paper, not entirely sure what she meant. He wondered if she'd forgotten their discussions with all of that head trauma and medication. For a moment, he wondered if she even knew who he was. Annalise was irritated to be in the hospital. The more she came off of the medication, the more she began to stir and stew. She wanted to get out of there. She was feeling desperate to get back to her search. Joe knew the feeling. "I'm here because you asked me for my help," he told her. "And you turned me down, as I recall." "I had a change of heart. Brought on by sympathy. Brought on by the fact that I still don't know why you wound up in here. I don't know if it's because of you or me or somehow the both of us." "You can leave," she told him. "Once I'm home, I'll give you a call. There's nothing that you can do for me here." She was a lot more polite when she was on drugs. Now she just seemed to want to be alone. He could feel a certain level of dislike for him. Given the fact that he'd spent the past couple of days sitting by her side and agreed to help her, he thought it was strange that she could feel that way. He nodded and stood up, folding the paper and setting it in the chair. He grabbed his hat and walked closer to her bedside, saying, "You don't like me very much. Is it that obvious?" "Why?" She hesitated for a moment before answering, as though she was considering her words carefully. For a second, Joe thought that she might be looking for a delicate way to answer, but he was wrong. She told him, "You're a liar. You lied straight to my face, and I'm sick of men who lie. Even now, your only interest in me is selfish." "I never lied to you." "You told me that you weren't psychic and couldn't help me. Now you're in here telling me that you can. Which is it, Mr. Oster?" "I'm not psychic," he told her, narrowing his eyes and sharpening his voice. He didn't like being called a liar. "I don't claim to be a psychic." "Then how can you help me?" "Maybe I can't, I don't know. But right now it looks like I'm your only option, so you can take it or leave it. I'll be happy to look for my own answers on my own time, whether you're involved or not." Her dislike for him seemed to be growing, even as her respect for him did the same. One thing that Joe never got used to was how often people could feel two completely different things at the same time. It made them hard to read. It took away his advantage. "The police aren't helping you. You've been trying to get them to for a year now, and they won't look twice at your case. I'm guessing that with your kind of money, you've probably tried the private detectives." She looked away from him. Even without his special skills, he would have been able to tell that she hadn't called a detective of her own. She was suddenly very guarded. "You haven't called a PI," he guessed. "Why not?" She licked her lips as though she was about to speak, but stopped herself. She was hiding something from him, but that didn't make her unusual. Everyone was hiding something, and each of those secrets felt dire to the person they belonged to. There was no way of knowing whether she was hiding something important or not. "What aren't you telling me?" She looked toward the window, gathering her thoughts. Slowly, her eyes moved across the room and back to Joe. She looked him right in the eye as she said, "My relationship with my sister was complicated. She was complicated." She wasn't lying. He knew that much. "What about the man they say she married? Who was he?" "Max," she said in a quiet tone, behind which there was fear, desperation, and something else that didn't sit well with Joe. Love. What was his last name? He asked her. I don't know it. She turned her head away from him again, toward the window. She gazed through it, as though her thoughts were 100 miles away. She was definitely holding back now. Did you love him? No, I hate him. She was hiding something, but telling the truth. He wished that he could read her thoughts rather than her emotions. It would make things so much easier if he could get the answers he wanted without having to decode a person's words and feelings. Why do you hate him? Her eyes shot back to him. She was visibly angry. If she wasn't still on some amount of painkillers, she might have cut the discussion off right there and told him to leave. Joe doubted that he would have gotten this much out of her if it wasn't for her still being slightly out of it. Of course, it made her that much harder to read as well. Her emotions were erratic. She seemed to feel a little bit of everything at some points. He wasn't sure what he could trust and what he couldn't, but he took it all in. When he felt something from her, he took note of it, and he decided to sort it all out later. Why do I hate him? She asked, with her jaw clenched and her hands balled into fists, gripping her blanket tightly. He took my sister. Was he in love with her? He was fascinated by her. He couldn't think of anything but my sister, she said, trailing off. Her look softened as she looked to the ceiling and her eyes filled with tears. I remember him saying, I love you, Leah. I love you. But the way he looked at her. She didn't finish that sentence, but he picked up on what she was feeling in that moment. Behind the rage and sadness, there was fear. It scared you, he guessed. Yes, it terrified me. And now I know why. Do you think he killed her? Annalise put her hands to her mouth as a faint laugh escaped through her lips, quickly replaced by tears in her eyes. She looked at Joe and said, My sister is probably wishing that she was dead. Why would he take her? What does he want with her? She remained silent for a long time. Joe could see that she was trying to figure out what she wanted to say, but she seemed to disagree with herself each time an answer came into her head. Finally, Annalise shook her head and said, Leah is the better sister. She always has been. She is beautiful and smart. I can't think of a reason why he wouldn't want her. That was all Joe wanted to ask that night. He had 100 more questions that needed to be answered, whether by Annalise or someone else, but for the moment, he was willing to let her rest and prepare to go home. Call me once you're home, he told her. I'm going to need your help if I'm going to find Max and figure out what he did with Leah. She nodded just slightly and settled into her pillow as though she wanted to go to sleep, but she didn't close her eyes. Joe walked toward the door and put his hand on the knob, but before he left, he turned and said, There's a reporter that's been sniffing around, looking to get an interview with you. His name's Roy Mitchell. I'm sure you've heard of him. The one who wrote the article about you. Joe nodded. He's looking for his next big story. Unless you want that to be you, I suggest you try to avoid him. I've told the desk to keep an eye out for him, but once you leave here, you'll be on your own. I can handle myself. I'm sure you can. I just thought you'd like a little bit of advance warning. With that, Joe left the hospital room and closed the door behind him. He walked out of the hospital into the cool evening air. As he stood on the sidewalk trying to figure out where he wanted to go from there, Joe couldn't help but look around for that mysterious car. He hadn't seen it since the night of the accident, but he had a hard time believing that it was gone for good. He didn't see the car anywhere. He saw about a dozen or so similar cars, which made him nervous as he walked down the sidewalk, but none of them were the right one. He could feel it in his bones. On top of looking for the car, he was keeping an eye peeled for Roy, who he hadn't seen for a while either. Joe knew that Roy wasn't going away that easily, and not knowing what the reporter was up to didn't sit well with him. He hadn't even worked at the bookstore in days, and Mary was forced to close it earlier than usual in order to avoid being fired from her real job. Too many balls in the air, and Joe was not one for juggling. The bar was open, but it was a bit too early for the big crowd to start rolling in. Mary was sitting on one of the bar stools while Vasya organized some of the freshly cleaned glasses in preparation for their night's work. Rummy was at the other end of the bar, tending to the early birds. They were the type of people that depressed Mary when she first started working there. She would watch them come in as soon as the sign on the door was flipped, and they wouldn't move for hours. In those early days of her working at the Capitol, the bar wasn't nearly as crowded as it had been since the article about Joe came out and the bar became something of a trendy drinking hole. Even when the bar opened early, those customers were quick to arrive, and each of them brought a fresh load of despair with them each time they sat themselves down on their favorite stool or hid in their favorite corner. She didn't know how Joe could manage it. Even without his skills, those customers made her want to sit in a dark room and cry. She didn't always know their stories, but she imagined that most of them had worked hard all their lives, and now they had nothing to show for it. Times were hard. The world was tough. Time went on and she got used to seeing them drink away their worries. She never liked seeing it, but at some point she learned to stop noticing it quite so much. But things were changing, for her at least. Business was picking up at the bar, and the customers weren't always the same mopers. She made more money in a single night's tips now than she had in a week before that article came out. Not that she was happy about what Roy wrote, but she was sure finding the silver lining. More than that, the publicity brought Sam into the bar. She had spent time with him every day since she waved him down in front of the store, and the more they talked, the more she found to like in him. He was kind and funny. He was strong but barely seemed to know it. Beneath all of that, though, Mary sensed something mysterious about Sam. They hadn't known each other all that long, so she was sure that he hadn't told her all of his deepest, darkest secrets. But she sensed that there was a story waiting to be told with him, and she thought that it had something to do with his time in the Navy. She wasn't sharing all of her secrets either, of course, so she could hardly blame him for not spilling everything on their first date, but she was curious to see what it was that would trouble as honorable a man as she thought Sam was. "You have that look again," Vasya said to her, looking up from the glasses that she was organizing. "What look?" "What look?" Vasya repeated with a slightly mocking tone. "That look you get whenever you start thinking about new boyfriend." "He's not my boyfriend," Mary corrected. "We've only been on a couple of dates." "Are you already imagining the wedding and house in the country?" Vasya smiled. "Because if you are, he's your boyfriend." Mary couldn't help but return the smile, trying to hide it behind her hand but failing. She told Vasya, "We went to a movie last night. It's the new Betty Davis picture. Oh, what's it called?" "Dark Victory." "Right, that's the one." "I've heard that it's a very good movie." "It's okay, I suppose. Nothing special," Mary shrugged. "But that theater, it was beautiful. The ceiling was painted to look like the sky, and it felt like we were watching a movie outside under the stars." "It sounds romantic." "It was." Vasya raised an eyebrow and suggestively asked, "So if I were to ask you how the movie ended?" Mary's eyes widened and she pursed her lips as she scolded Vasya, saying, "I happen to be a very respectable lady, thank you. And besides, Sam would never dream of doing that sort of thing in a place like that." "He hasn't kissed you yet?" Mary held up a finger. "I never said that." She fell silent for a moment before asking Vasya, "Does a kiss on the cheek count?" "That depends on which part of country you're in. In this town, it probably doesn't." "Anyway, Sam promised to take me to the fair tomorrow. You know, the World's Fair." "I've heard of it." "You want to come? I told him that I'd ask you to come, sort of like a double date with his roommate." Vasya cringed as she grabbed a rag and began wiping down the bar. It was obvious that she wasn't interested in dating Sid. "It doesn't have to be like a real date. You could just go and have fun, and let him pay for everything." Still, Vasya didn't say anything. She just shook her head and set out a few clean ashtrays. "You know you want to go. The world of tomorrow. Who wouldn't want to see that? They have all sorts of neat things. Maybe we could even stop by the Soviet Pavilion. It would be just like going home for you." "Don't let my accent fool you. I am home." "Accent? What accent? You speak better English than I do." Now Vasya laughed. As soon as she did that, Mary knew that she was going to give in and agree to the date. Still, Vasya took her time. She fell silent for a moment and thought about it. She nodded to herself as though she were asking and answering questions on her own. Mary waited patiently. She knew the process of wearing Vasya down, and it was not a short one. Vasya wasn't easily swayed. She was just about the most stubborn person that Mary knew, but she had a lot in common with Mary's mother, so Mary knew all of the angles to play in order to get what she wanted. She leaned her elbows on the bar and rested her chin in her hands, waiting for Vasya to crumble. Vasya went about her work at the bar, never looking at Mary as she said, "I don't know what you're waiting for. You've already told them that I'd go. I really don't think that I have choice in matter." "So you will?" Vasya waved her hand in the air as though she was shooing away a fly, and with an exaggerated accent said, Da, I will go to your World's Fair." Mary smiled from ear to ear. She hopped off of her stool and said, "We're going to have a great time. You just wait and see. You and Sid? Well, you've already made music together. What's left to do?" Vasya threw her rag at Mary. Sam didn't enjoy his job very much. Half of his day was spent sorting the mail of people who were more important and successful than he was. Even their paper looked fancier. He rarely knew exactly what each envelope contained, but he could imagine. He pictured important documents sent from clients and angry arguments sent from the other side's lawyers. In his mind, there were entire cases being argued right there in those letters, property disputes and bitter divorces, maybe even a murder. He could spend the entire day sorting the mail and telling himself stories. None of them were close to the truth, he was sure, but whatever those envelopes were, they mattered. The people that he was delivering them to mattered. The office where they worked mattered. And the mail delivery boy could vanish off the face of the planet and be replaced without anyone ever noticing. He walked through the office, passing out the mail, and rarely did anyone ever care enough to look up from their desk. Even the secretaries seemed to be more important than him. But what could he do? It wasn't like there were better jobs out there for him. Even if someone was hiring, odds were they'd take one look at his resume and kick him out the door. He mattered once, or at least he thought he did. He was a Navy man, and the very sight of him in uniform made people straighten up. Men wanted to shake his hand, women wanted to kiss his cheek. Every other man in uniform was his brother, and most importantly, he felt like he was making a difference in the world, even if he'd only ever made it as far as Lakehurst, New Jersey. Now he was delivering mail in an office. He couldn't even get a job with the real post office. He was delivering mail that had already been delivered once. Not that he was complaining. He never complained. He didn't blame anyone for what had happened to him except himself. He didn't make excuses for why his life had gotten off track. He knew why, and if he ever forgot, he had it written out on an official document handed to him by the U.S. government. Christopher Lowell Jenkins, as it was written on the office door, was Sam's cousin. He was a few years older than Sam and Harvey, so while they were close, Christopher was always off living his own life. When they were younger, Sam and Harvey would sit in Harvey's front lawn and watch Chris and his friends drive down the street in his buddy's old Model T, which the older group of guys always seemed to be tinkering with. They nicknamed the car Lizzie and even painted the name on the driver's side. There were a handful of times when Chris would wave Sam and Harvey over and tell them to hop in. They'd go for a ride around the town, wind blowing in their hair. It made Sam feel like one of the older guys when they did that, like he was important. He even waved to his younger friends as the car passed them on the street, hoping to make them jealous. Chris was no longer Chris. Now he was Christopher Lowell Jenkins. Before Sam saw that name on the door to his office, he didn't even know Chris's middle name. The job in the mailroom came from Sam's aunt, insisting that Chris help his cousin out. For his part, Chris seemed happy to do it, at least to Sam's face. But Sam could tell that Chris was uncomfortable having him there. He didn't make small talk at the office. He didn't offer more than a smile and a nod when they passed each other in the hallway. One time, in the lobby, Chris was in the elevator with a few of his coworkers, while Sam was hurrying to get in before the doors closed. He could have sworn that Chris saw him coming, but he allowed those doors to close, and Sam had to wait for the next ride up. At family gatherings, things were normal. Sam was part of the family and the conversations, but in the city, it was like they hardly knew each other. Chris was driving a much more expensive car nowadays, and he was not likely to tell Sam to get in and take a ride. Sam should have resented Chris for that. He should have been angry that his own cousin would treat him the way he did. But he wasn't. Chris knew what happened to Sam's career in the Navy, and he had just enough sympathy for his cousin to get him a job, while having that same look of doubt, and maybe even a little bit of disgust, that everyone had in their eyes whenever they heard the truth about Sam. Well, everyone except Sid. He never seemed to care about Sam's past one way or the other, as long as Sam managed to pay his half of the rent. For a long time, he was the only one who Sam could spend any amount of time with without feeling like a monster or a reject from some failed experiment. Now there was Mary. When she looked at him, she didn't see his past, probably because she knew nothing about his past. All she knew was what he wanted her to know, and as unimpressive as it was, that image of him was all that he ever wanted her to see. She could laugh at his jokes and even make fun of him, all without holding back, as though he was a bomb that could explode at any moment. She had no reason to feel disgusted by him. She had no reason to act as though she didn't know him whenever she was in the company of her friends. She looked at him, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Sam felt like a normal person. He felt like a man. Then he would say goodnight and go home. He would splash water on his face and look at himself in the mirror, and he would see the same thing that the rest of the world saw when they looked at him. He saw weakness. His work was not terribly involved. Any child could have done it, and probably a lot faster. He sorted the mail and delivered it to the more important employees of the law firm, keeping his head down and trying to avoid the whispered conversations that he always suspected were taking place behind his back. Even if none of those people knew about him, he felt like they did. He always felt like he was being watched and followed. Even at home, he never felt like he was alone. Sam must have checked his watch every 5 minutes that day. He was just waiting for that moment when he could leave the office behind and make his way back to the world where he belonged. The subway ride, to him, was like making the trip from Wonderland back to the real world. Things made sense, at least for the time being. Who knew what would happen when Mary discovered the truth? He couldn't wait to see her. Just the thought of her smile made him grin, which he didn't realize until late in the day. He wondered if he had been walking around with that grin on his face and what people must have thought of him because of it. But he didn't care. He wanted to smile. The plan for the evening was to go straight from work to the bar. He had run through the path in his head about 100 times during the day, all the way up to the moment when he'd walk through the door and see her standing by the bar, carrying her tray of drinks. As he ran through this plan, he wasn't paying as much attention to his work as he should have been. Twice he delivered an envelope to the wrong desk. Luckily, the two desks weren't close to each other, and both times he could laugh it off and tell the secretaries that the envelopes must have stuck together. They didn't care enough about him to question his explanation. Normally, he might dwell on that fact and let it bother him for the rest of the day. But not this time. He was in too good a mood for that. At the end of the day, he rushed to grab his jacket and get out of the building. But just as he hit the sidewalk and made his way into the flow of people that were rushing to get to the same subway station as him, he reached into his pocket and discovered that his keys were missing. His heart stopped short, feeling each of his other pockets, checking his pants and his jacket, but the keys were nowhere to be found. He was annoyed. The last thing he wanted to do was go back to that building. Each time he walked through the lobby, he felt smaller than the last. But he didn't have a choice. He did it as quickly as possible. He rushed through the lobby, keeping his head down. At one point, he thought that he might have seen Chris walking past him, but he didn't slow down enough to get a good look. As he approached the elevator doors, they were just about to close. He refused to be trapped in the lobby for any longer than he had to be. He rushed to the elevator and managed to catch the doors right before they shut. He got into the elevator and pressed the button for his floor, looking down at his watch. Even if there was no set time that he had to meet her, he felt like he was going to be late. The elevator had 3 other people in it, none of whom Sam was particularly interested in. He kept his eyes on the doors, waiting for them to open, tapping his hand on his leg. It was taking forever for the elevator to reach his floor. When the doors finally opened and he stepped into the hallway, he was followed by one of the other men from the elevator. He almost didn't even notice the man until they were nearly at the glass doors which led to the firm where Sam worked. As he opened the door, he instinctively held it open for the other man. As the other man walked past him, he smiled a thanks and said, "You look about as eager to be here as I am." "Yes, sir," Sam responded, hoping not to be caught in a long conversation. He'd never seen the man before, so as far as he knew, it wasn't one of his bosses. "The lawyers' offices give you the creeps too?" the man asked, as they both walked through the office. "It's not the office that does it, sir," Sam said, still distracted by the time and not watching his words as carefully as he should have. Once he realized what he'd said, Sam felt a chill run through his spine. He could have very well just gotten himself fired. The man let out a hearty chuckle and slapped Sam on the back, saying, "You know it." The man then turned toward one of the offices and continued on his path, leaving Sam to walk alone. He hurried to the mailroom, which was really little more than a closet, and began to search for his keys. He looked on the floor, thinking that they might have fallen out of his jacket when he was putting it on, but he didn't find them there. He looked on the cabinets and shelves, but his keys weren't anywhere to be seen. Once he was done searching the room, Sam stood back and put his hands on his hips, trying to think of where else his keys might have fallen out of his pocket. The thought of searching the entire office gave him a headache. That's when he felt them. With his hands on his hips, Sam felt a lump in his back pocket. When he checked to see what that lump was, he found his keys right there in his pocket, as though he'd never lost them in the first place. He held the keys in his hand, looking at them as though they had just grown a mouth and said hello to him, and wondering if he really was losing his mind. Despite the reaction of the public, Roy's article about the psychic who helped to find the missing boy did not make him the most popular reporter in the office. Every time he passed one of his co-workers, they would make jokes about his story. Sometimes they would forget the jokes and call him a hack right to his face. He didn't care what the other reporters thought of him. His job was to report the news, and as long as he was doing that, he was happy to be the target of whatever jokes they wanted to throw at him. Roy hadn't gotten into the business of reporting the news because it made him popular. He didn't get into it because he loved writing either. As corny as it may have sounded, Roy had become a reporter because he loved information. He loved the truth, and he wanted to find the truth when other people were trying to cover it up. Hunting that truth was what motivated Roy to get out of bed in the morning. Yes, this sometimes blinded Roy to the people around him. It made him insensitive to how those truths could damage someone's life. He never meant to hurt anyone. In fact, Roy wanted to help people. He wanted to make things right when everyone was intent on keeping them wrong. And the more everyone tried to hide the truth from him, the more fun he had in exposing them. The disappearance of Leah Meyer was all he could think about now. But it wasn't the first time this sort of thing had happened. People went missing all the time, and Roy was getting tired of those stories going nowhere. He was tired of never finding answers. He'd been told to move on. His editor, William Tovey, had told him that writing about a woman that the police don't even care about wasn't going to sell papers. He needed something new to cover, and it had better not involve any mystical nonsense. The novelty of such fantasies would sell papers once, but that was all Tovey was willing to allow. Roy should have been looking for new stories to cover, but he wasn't. Instead, he was sitting outside of Annalise Meyer's apartment building, waiting for her. Earlier that morning, he'd called the hospital to speak with her, and he'd been told that she'd been released. She was on her way home, and he was much closer to that home than she was. If he could just get her to speak with him, maybe he could prove that there was more to this story. He could play up the desperate family angle. He just needed something to run with. Roy sat in the front steps of Annalise Meyer's building, holding an old wooden cross in his hand, flipping it between his fingers without even realizing what he was doing. The cross had been handled by him so often over the years that it was now dirty, and oils from his hands had seeped into it. This was the only clue in the first mystery that Roy had chased answers to. His own mystery. It had been left with him at a train station when he was a baby, and it was the only thing in the world that connected him to whatever long-forgotten family that he once had. If there was a root to Roy's need for answers, that family was it. He never did solve his own mystery, and he never knew his own story, so he did his best to uncover the stories of others. People deserved to know the truth. He deserved to know it. So, despite what he had been told by his editor, Roy couldn't just drop the story now. He wasn't finished with it. The neighborhood that the Meyer woman lived in was not the ritziest he had ever seen, but it was nice. The people who walked the sidewalk seemed like your average men and women. Some looked like their clothes might have been a couple of years old. Others could have stepped out of the clothing store 5 minutes earlier. There were lots of families with pudgy little kids, suggesting that this area was far from being the worst off. But that was only a guess. Normally, Roy was good at reading his surroundings, but that neighborhood had a mix of just about everything. Where Annalise Meyer fit into that group, he couldn't tell quite yet. As he sat there, the door behind him opened and a little boy walked out of the building. He was wearing short pants and a striped shirt and sat down right beside Roy. The kid didn't say anything. He just watched the people on the street the same way Roy was. "See anything interesting?" Roy asked. "Nuh-uh," the boy replied. "Do you?" "Nuh-uh." They fell into silence again. Roy slipped his cross into his pocket and grabbed a cigarette. As he lit the cigarette, he asked the kid, "You smoke?" The boy shook his head. As Roy blew a cloud of smoke into the air around them, he nodded and said, "You should try it. It calms the nerves. Say, do you happen to know a lady who lives here, Annalise Meyer?" "No," the boy replied. Roy nodded again, accepting the answer and leaning back on his elbows. He said, "You're not a whole lot of help, you know that?" "I'm 8. That's no excuse. I've known 7-year-olds who are more use than you. You need to open your eyes more, look around at people, get an idea of who they are and what they're up to." Roy reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He handed it to the boy and said, "Here, let me know if you ever spot anything important. I'll give you credit in small print." "How much do you pay?" the boy asked. "How much do I pay?" Roy grinned, taking another puff. "I'll pay you 5 cents to get lost right now, that's how much I pay." The boy jumped to his feet and started to run toward the door to the building. Before entering, he stopped himself and ran back to Roy, holding out his hand. Roy dropped a nickel into the boy's hand. "Oh boy!" the boy yelled, running into the building. A moment later, a woman walked through the door and stood over Roy looking down at him. She asked, "Did you give my son a nickel?" "Yeah." "Why?" "So he'd leave me alone." She looked toward the door, hands on her hips and shaking her head. She said, "It usually only takes a penny." Roy shrugged before asking, "You know a dame who lives here named Annalise Meyer?" "In passing, mostly. We used to say hello in the hall all the time and make conversation about the weather and how our day was going, that sort of thing. Not very much lately, though." "Been like that for over a year now?" "Mm-hmm. I barely see her at all anymore. She rushes around and tries to avoid people, I think." "You ever meet her sister?" "Once. Oh, the smell on her." "Smell?" "Like a brewery." "She liked to drink, huh? Do you know anything else about her?" "No. Are you the police?" "A reporter. The kid has my card. Use it if you think of anything about her or her sister that might be useful." "Useful to what? Did she do something?" "No. Her sister's missing, that's all." "And you think she killed her sister? Did she hide the body in the cellar? How did she cover up the smell? Goodness, my kids play down in that cellar. What if they find her body?" "Gosh, lady, you make up stories faster than the Times." "So she hasn't killed anyone?" "Not that I know of, anyway, though I'm starting to think that you might have." There was a loud bang from within the building. The woman jumped as though a gun had gone off. Once she pulled herself together, she looked toward the door and said, "I think my kids just broke something. I should probably go. Let me know if you see anything strange." "I will." He waited for her to leave, but the woman didn't go anywhere right away. After a few seconds, he looked up at her and saw that her hand was extended. Roy shook his head. With a huff, the woman walked into the building, leaving him alone to enjoy his cigarette and wait for Annalise Meyer to get home. He waited another half hour before a cab finally pulled up to the curb and its back door swung open. Annalise slowly moved one leg out the door and twisted herself to get the other out. She was straining and in pain. It was the perfect moment to approach her. Roy dropped his cigarette and ran to the curb. He held out a hand and said, "Let me help you there." "Thanks," she replied, wincing with pain each time she moved. It took time and patience, but Annalise finally pulled herself out of the car and got to her feet with Roy's help. He took her arm and led her to the steps of the building. Each step was a struggle to get up. Once they were standing at the top of the steps, she smiled weakly at him and said, "Thank you, I'm fine from here." "It's no trouble at all, Miss Meyer." She stopped short and looked at him with puzzled eyes. She tilted her head slightly and said, "You look familiar to me. Have we met?" "Briefly, at the hospital. My name's Roy Mitchell." At the sound of his name, she turned and started to reach for the doorknob. "I just want to help you," he told her. "I can have your story all over the East Coast. Your sister's picture could be on the breakfast table of thousands of people, millions maybe, but more likely thousands." "I've read your work," she told him, wincing with pain as she looked his way. "It's second rate. If I wanted press coverage, I'd go to someone far more respectable." "Like who? You know many reporters who are jumping at the chance to tell your story after all this time?" She looked around the area. It was clear that she was uncomfortable, not just because of the pain, but because she felt exposed. To Roy, it looked like she expected someone to jump out from behind a bush and gun her down. Not that he could blame her. She had been run over, after all. "I don't want my story in the newspaper. Now I'll thank you to leave me alone." "Why wouldn't you want your story in the paper?" "I just don't. And if you press the matter, I will make sure that you never write another story again. Do you understand me?" "Not at all, but I'll pretend if you'd like." "Please do. And while you're at it, never come here again." She pulled the door to her building open and tried her best to make a powerful exit, but her condition prevented her from being very graceful at all. Roy stood there, a bit surprised by her reluctance to talk to him. In his experience, most families wanted the picture of a missing person on as many newspapers as they could get. Now, either Joe Oster had convinced her to avoid Roy, or something else was going on. It really didn't matter to him which of those scenarios was the most likely. Either way, he didn't plan on giving up. The more someone protested a story, the more worthwhile that story usually was. As he turned and started to walk down the steps, he tried to think of his next move. All he'd learned that day was that the Meyer sister knew how to drink. It wasn't much to work with, but it would have to be good enough. Joe was in the bookstore waiting for the phone to ring. He'd been there ever since he left the hospital, and while he did open the store for business, he had only seen one customer since his arrival. While he waited, Joe tried to think of some way to become more proactive. As it was, he was constantly waiting for the next bit of information to drop in his lap. He was waiting for Annalise to get her senses back and then allow him to look through her sister's things. The process was taking too long. He had decided to look into the disappearance of Leah Meyer days ago, and then it was like he just gave up trying. There were a stack of old telephone directories in the back room of the bookstore. He'd always meant to throw them away, but he never got around to it. For the longest time, it had always seemed like there was some excuse to make in order to avoid cleaning up that back room and getting rid of those directories. Now, he finally felt justified in his laziness. He started with the directory from 2 years earlier, 1937. He flipped through the listings looking for the M section. His theory was that if the sisters were always fighting, they probably didn't live together, so he skimmed the listings looking for Leah's name. It wasn't hard to find. There were 2 Leah Meyers listed and 1 L. Meyer. He grabbed the current directory and flipped to the same listings. Now there was only 1 Leah Meyer and the L. Meyer. His best guess was that the missing Meyer was in fact the missing Meyer. He copied the phone number and address onto a piece of paper and closed the directories. His first instinct was to dial the number and see who answered. Maybe they could shed some light on what had happened to Leah Meyer, or at least confirm that this was the right number. But if he picked up the phone, he might miss Annalise's call. He put the piece of paper with Leah Meyer's number on the counter next to the cash register, and he stared at it. Minutes passed. He told himself that if he had just made the call when he first found the number, he would have been done with it by now, and he wouldn't have missed Annalise at all. He was tempted to hurry up and make that call, but he stopped himself. Each minute that passed was a minute closer to her getting home and calling him. His thinking was getting him nowhere. He always dared himself to do things, and then he chickened out at the last minute, preventing anything from ever getting done. Maybe this really was the wrong line of work for him. Maybe he should just go back to selling books for as long as he could keep the store open, and then look into getting his old job at the post office back. It felt like another life. The memory of walking up and down the street was like remembering a movie or a book about someone else. He remembered the uncontrollable emotions and how they had worn him down. Now he could keep himself together. He was sure of it. Actually, he was positive of it. At that moment, as he waited for the phone to ring, there were dozens or hundreds of people walking past his store, and he hadn't felt any of them until he thought about them. Once his eyes went to the window and his mind went to the people outside, he could feel them the same as always. But for that span of time when his mind was on the search for answers, those people might as well have not existed at all. The phone rang, and Joe's eyes shot toward the counter before he even realized what the sound was. Before he knew it, he was standing behind the counter, holding the receiver in his hand, raising it to his ear. "Hello," he said, wondering if it would be her or just some stranger looking for a copy of Gone with the Wind. There was silence on the other end of the line. He could tell that someone was there, but they were taking their time when it came to talking. They were considering their words, maybe, or her pain might have gotten the best of her. Either way, the silence seemed to last forever as he waited for her to speak. Even though he didn't know what she was going to say, he was sure that she was now capable of giving him the information that he needed. She was in the comfort and security of her own home, with nobody listening or poking their heads in. She wasn't drugged up. Now it was all up to her. "Roy Mitchell came to see me," she told him at last. It wasn't what he had expected to hear. "What?" Joe replied, sounding just a little bit disappointed that this was all she chose to say when she finally spoke. "That reporter friend of yours. I know who he is. Why was he there?" "He's looking for a story. Why else?" "Did you tell him anything?" "No," she said, before falling silent once again. After some time, she added, "Though I'm not sure that remaining quiet is the best choice either. I don't want anything to do with the press. I understand, but I have to think about my sister. Just let me see what I can do to find her before you talk to him." She took a deep breath, which he could hear through the phone. She then said, "You wanted to know his name." Joe didn't even catch on to what she was saying. He was about to ask her to clarify what she meant when she said, "Weber, Max Weber. Find him and you'll find my sister." The phone went dead. She hung up. That was as much information as he would be getting from her that night, and honestly, it annoyed him. She had come to him for help, and now it was as though he were being led around like a puppy. He wasn't sure when he had become the one chasing her down, but he would have to have a talk with her about it, in person. Until he did talk to her, Joe was going to pursue his other avenues. He had a name for Max now, which meant that he could track down not just Max himself, but the circles that Max and Leah traveled in. He went to the paper that was sitting on the counter, which had the last known phone number and address of Leah Meyer, and he wrote Max's name on that paper right next to hers. He stared at it, wondering where that name would lead him, but he somehow doubted that the paper was going to talk, so he picked up the phone and dialed. He listened while the phone rang on the other end of the line, and waited for whoever would answer. Finally, someone picked up. It was a woman's voice, offering no more than a simple, "Hello." Joe hadn't thought about what he wanted to say to the person that answered the phone. He didn't write down a list of questions that he could read off. All he had to work with was the name. "I'm looking for Leah Meyer," he said to the woman on the other end. There was a pause, followed by, "I'm sorry, but you must have the wrong number. There's no Leah here." "Right," Joe said. Obviously, he wasn't going to find her there. If Annalise hadn't been smart enough to check Leah's own apartment, she was far less intelligent than he thought. "What I mean is, I think that she used to live there, in your apartment. I was wondering if you might have any information on her, a forwarding address, or maybe she left something behind." "I'm sorry, no. You might ask the manager of the building. He'd be the one who would know that sort of thing," she said. "Do you have his number on hand?" I don't right now. I'm sorry, but I really have to go." "Okay, thanks." And that was it. Yet another avenue pursued with nothing to show for his effort. He did still have the address, though, and he could go to the building in the morning, looking for the manager. Until then, he still had Max's name, which he could look up in the telephone directory. He started with the most current directory that he had on hand and fished through the listings. There were more Weebers than he would have liked, and Max was a common name, so he picked up the phone and he dialed the first number. It rang. "Hello?" came a voice on the other end, another woman. "I'm looking for Max Weber," Joe said. "Who's calling?" "My name is Joe. Tell him that I'm a friend of Annalise Meyer." "Who? Aw, hold on a sec," the woman moaned before yelling, "Max!" She put the phone down, and Joe heard nothing but muffled sounds and mumbling until someone picked up the receiver. "Yeah," the man, presumably Max Weber, said. "Is this Max?" "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Joe. I'm a friend of Annalise Meyer. Do you know her?" "Never heard of her." "I must have the wrong number then. Sorry." Joe hung up the phone and crossed off the name in the directory. He moved on and dialed the next number. The conversation with the man who answered it played out very much like the first Max Weber, and the next, and the one after that. He managed to make his way through the list before it got too late to keep calling. Each time, the man on the other end of the line told him that they had no idea who Annalise Meyer was. Of course, they could have been lying. Any one of them could have been the Max Weber that Joe was looking for, and he'd have no way of knowing. He couldn't read people over the phone. He was discouraged when he didn't find anything, though he wasn't surprised. He knew that Max supposedly moved out of the city, but he was hoping that the information had been wrong. He was hoping for someone that he could meet with and talk to face to face. But, just like all of the other leads, he was left with nothing. For all he knew, he wasn't even looking at the right directory. He had just assumed that Max Weber would have lived near Leah Meyer, but for all he knew, he could have lived in the Bronx or Brooklyn, while Joe was looking for him in Manhattan. He couldn't stop to second-guess himself. If he did that, he'd end up looking through every directory in the tri-state area. His gut had told him to look in Manhattan, so that was where he was going to look, at least until the morning, when he'd be able to dig a little deeper. He placed the 1937 directory next to the 1939 directory and went through the list that he had just called, crossing off the names in the 1937 directory as he went. Not all of those same listings were in the 1937 book, and for all he knew, some of those older listings that weren't in the 1939 book were the same people, just living in a different place. At the end of that experiment, he was left with 8 Max Webers who could have been his man. He wrote down all of those addresses and phone numbers on a piece of paper and closed the directories. Until he had more to work with, they wouldn't be much use to him. But if he could go to Leah Meyer's old apartment building, maybe he could start connecting a few pieces of this puzzle. Vasya didn't have time for singing that night at the bar, but she didn't mind. The place was crowded with young, energetic people who wanted to drink the night away while keeping themselves entertained. The moment 2 of the girls broke into their own rendition of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, she decided that this would not be a night for her to perform. She watched those girls laughing as they locked arms and danced in circles, and she wondered if either one of them understood the meaning of the song. Still, when she brought them their drinks, she smiled as though she was enjoying the show. "You sing, don't you?" one of the men at their table asked Vasya. "Sure she does. We've seen her sing before," a friend of his replied. "Well then, sing," the first man yelled playfully. "Give us a show." Vasya smiled and looked up to see the 2 girls still singing and dancing. She then looked back to the men and said, "I'm sorry. I don't have the sheet music for The World Owes Me a Living." "Aw, come on. Sing that one you did the other night. What was it? The one with the tree and the fruit." "Strange fruit?" Vasya asked. "Yeah, that's the one. It had that bluesy sound to it. I could slow dance to that." Vasya looked down at the man for a moment, waiting for him to show some sign of having been joking. When she didn't see that sign, she simply smiled politely and walked away from the table as quickly as she could. To stay would have only gotten her into trouble. Strange Fruit was a song that she'd heard around town over the previous months, from friends who worked in nightclubs and attended protests. It was a song about lynchings in the southern states, and the thought of someone thinking of that song as a dance number made her want to break her tray over his head. Vasya Baskova came to America 6 years earlier, arriving on the West Coast. She was 15 at the time, and she left everything that she knew back in Russia. Her parents and her siblings were left behind forever, and as she crossed that ocean, she asked herself over and over again if it was worth it. She arrived at a time when Americans were down on their luck. They were losing their homes, starving, dressed in rags. But the thing that struck her more than any of that was how they spoke about their situation. It was a thing that happened to them, not the way things had always been. Even through their struggle, they would talk about the day when things would get better. Some even planned on being rich. It wasn't something that could never happen. It wasn't a dream. It was a goal. What a person earned was theirs to keep. In those early days, she felt as though she had woken up from a horrible dream. The place she'd come from was fading into nothing more than a memory. The only catch was that her family wasn't there by her bed when she opened her eyes. Life wasn't easy, but then she had never had an easy life. In this world of depression, she was one of the few people who felt as though she had moved upward, and the idea that things would only get better amazed her. She found work where she could, but she wanted to keep moving. She wanted to see it all. She had been raised on a steady diet of stories about the horrors of the United States, but when she went home at night, she heard whispers that painted a completely different picture. Now that she had the chance to see it for herself, she wanted to explore it all. She wanted to get to know the world of myth and legend. She wanted to see if the man on the boat was joking when he said that the streets were paved with gold, and she wasn't even disappointed to discover that they weren't, because what she found was a treasure that she never could have dreamed of. She moved across the country from shore to shore, eating with people, listening to their stories about the way things had once been. She listened to the preachers preach and the politicians blather on. It didn't matter what these people believed or what she agreed with. All that mattered was that they were saying what they wanted to say, and nobody was stopping them. Well, nobody was stopping most of them. During her journey across the country, she did see people who were belittled and treated poorly. She was disgusted by the way free people could treat others, based solely on the color of their skin or their religion. She hated that she had seen a crack in the armor of America, and beneath that armor, she caught a glimpse of the world she left behind. But even those people of color sang, and their songs were beautiful, painful songs. They were gaining popularity around the country, but Vasya wondered how many of those fans really understood the roots of that music. How many people knew the fabric of their own society? She found the country perplexing. It was wondrous and magical and frustratingly absurd all at the same time. It was better than where she'd been, but that wasn't good enough anymore. She had learned to set goals and plan for a day when things would get better. After all her travels, she finally hit another ocean, and the most beautiful city she had ever seen. Every type of person she could imagine she met. She didn't have to move around anymore, because if she sat still, the world would come to her. Somehow, as she was standing still, she found herself surrounded by people that she cared about, and a room to call her own for as long as she could afford to keep it. As she stood by the bar and looked across the capital, she saw Mary standing by a table talking to Sam and Sid. They were laughing, and undoubtedly planning their trip to the fair. And though she was not likely to admit it, Vasya found herself feeling proud of the fact that she was going with them. Mary was, in some ways, like one of the siblings that Vasya had lost when she came to America. And then there was Joe. He was a mess when she first met him. At first she assumed that he was just like everyone else. She assumed that he was wallowing in self-pity, waiting for the world to fix itself instead of working to make it better. But then she realized that it wasn't self-pity at all. It was pity for everyone but himself. He had a home and a stable job, and when she met him, he had a family. He had the American dream, and yet he saw the misery that surrounded him, and he didn't turn his back on it. He let it in. He felt it until it nearly destroyed him. He was someone that she could never understand. She could see that he needed to do something about that world around him, but he didn't. He doubted that he could make a difference, but he was wrong. Vasya firmly believed that Joe Oster could save the world, if only he would try. Joe was at Leah's old address by 9 o'clock the next morning. The building wasn't much to look at. The stairs were badly chipped and the railing was loose. The door needed a new coat of paint. Inside, the floor was squeaky, and water stains marked the floor right inside of the door. The place smelled musty and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. He found the door marked manager and knocked. He waited for the door to open, but that never happened. Looking around the place, Joe had to wonder if the manager was out or if he was just trying to avoid the complaints of the building's tenants. "He's not an easy man to catch," came the voice of a man, shaky and old. Joe looked to the stairs which led up to the rest of the apartments, and he saw the man standing midway up, looking down at him. He held a cane, but he wasn't using it for support. The man looked to be at least 80. He was skinny and wrinkled. Just to look at him, Joe would have thought that he was on the verge of death, but his eyes told another story. They showed strength. "Even when he's in, you'd be lucky to get him to sit still," the man told Joe. "And he's not in." "Do you know when he'll be back? I need to speak to him." "He comes and goes. It could be hours or it could be days. Most folks around here don't hold their breath." Joe nodded and reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled the picture of Leah. He walked to the man and held it out. The man took the picture and held it at a distance, squinting as he attempted to look at it. He then pulled it closer and squinted even more. "She used to live here, I think. I was hoping that you might know her," Joe explained. "She's 2D, the man nodded. "I remember her." "What can you tell me about her?" "Well, I can tell you that she was pushy, always fighting with someone or another." "Her sister?" "Her sister, her boyfriend, her neighbors." "Do you remember any of these fights? What they were about?" "Oh, I don't know. The usual things, I guess. I think her boyfriend decided to move on, and she didn't like that very much." "Max?" "If that was his name," the man shrugged. "I think she thought he was seeing another girl, so she was yelling at him, crying about how she was better than the other one. That sort of thing." "Her sister hasn't heard from Leah in about a year. Some people think she ran off and married this Max fellow." The old man shook his head. "She would have married him, but he wasn't about to marry her. When he left here, he stood right at that door and told her that he didn't want her. He never did." "Did you ever get a look at him?" "Once or twice." "How'd he look?" The old man curled the corners of his mouth down and said, "About average height, average weight, light hair. He wore suits." At least now Joe had an idea of what Max looked like. He wasn't sure that it did him any good, but it was more than he had walked in with. He decided to change directions and asked, "What about her sister, Annalise? Do you remember her?" The old man shrugged and said, "I try to mind my own business." "I see." Joe was about to ask another question when the old man put up a finger and waved it, recalling a memory. He said, "But she was nice. She held the door open for people and smiled when you walked past her. I'll tell you, the two of them might have come from the same place, but they sure took different roads getting here, if you know what I'm saying." Joe nodded, taking in the information and trying to figure out his next question. Before he could ask anything, the old man asked him, "She disappeared, you say?" "Leah, yes. You didn't happen to hear anything strange about early May of last year?" Joe asked. With a smile, the old man said, "I have a hard time remembering last week." For a guy who claimed to have bad memory and to mind his own business, the man seemed to know a lot. From what Joe could tell, the old man was happy to be talking to anyone. He felt almost excited when Joe paid him any mind at all. He was lonely. Joe's instinct was to stay and talk with the man some more. He hated walking away when someone felt bad in any way. He felt like it made him a bad person to act like he didn't care. But experience had taught him that he couldn't help everyone. The more he tried, the less he could accomplish. Even if he did stay with the man and listen to him talk about the good old days, he would eventually have to leave. and the old man would go back to the same life that he had before Joe walked through that door. He pushed aside the man's feelings and put a smile on his face, saying, "Thanks for your help." And then he turned and walked away.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.